good morning or good evening, everybody, depending upon what time zone you're in. It's great to see you all here. As with last week, I'm chairing the meeting again. This afternoon's meeting, or today's meeting, is on art and socialism. If you go to the average council estate in any poverty-stricken area of Britain, you'll see tower blocks and houses with kids in them. And hundreds of those kids have got the intellectual potential of Shakespeare or Picasso or Beethoven. But because of the conditions they're brought up in, because of the schools that they go to, because of the way the education system is geared to make people feel that they've been put in their proper place, the huge talent that resides in the brains of those, in the imaginations, in the consciousness, in the dreams of those working class kids will never reach the huge, tremendous potential that it's capable of. Lower income families, the Musicians Union has just been in the news this week for saying, are priced out of the market in music education. Kids are unable to afford the materials they need for artwork, you know, the canvases, the paints and so on. They're unable to visit galleries because sometimes of the cost of going there, sometimes because of the remoteness of the areas that they live in. They're unable to go to concerts where they get inspiration. At the same time, there are dozens of artists like Alan Brack, who is with us this afternoon, who fight for social justice. They don't just do art, they also fight for social justice. There are thousands of artists, for example, in the Black Lives Matter movement, who reflect the movement, who reflect the creativity and the imaginations and the aspirations of the communities, the downtrodden communities that they represent. We're very privileged to have Alan with us to talk to us today. Alan has been an anti-racist campaigner in Bradford since the 1970s and 1980s. He's a community artist and a community activist. He's organised the Bradford Arts Festival, which has become Bradford Transformed. And Alan's going to talk to us for about half an hour, first of all, this afternoon on, that's the heading coming up, art and socialism. Alan, it's a great privilege to welcome you to this meeting, and it's over to you.
Ed, you're very kind, and thank you for that opening. I have to say, first of all, I just want to get a few apologies out the way so that they're done. I mean, first of all, I'm no art historian or political theorist, really. So what I'm hoping to offer the meeting is my practical experience and my life experiences. I'm also quite nervous about this presentation because I haven't done anything like it in at least 4 or 5 years. And I'm knocking on a bit older now. And what I do promise, so I've had to make lots of notes. So I hope that this is joined up enough for you. And if I lose my notes, I promise not to go to Peppa Pigland. So at least we'll get somewhere with this discussion. The other thing is that a lot of the examples that I want to maybe talk about and give and ways forward, possibly things to do, are based on my experience in the UK. And, you know, I'm sure that like art, so much of the struggle is universal these days with global capitalism and the like, that it will still resonate with people from other countries. By the arts, I mean all art forms, or I hope we all do, that they all have a role to play. So from visual art to performance to music, to theatre, to poetry, to writing, to filmmaking, to photography, to banner making, to all sorts of art forms that exist. I would say that they're all very relevant to this discussion. I'd like to start, first of all, by just very briefly telling you a little bit about myself, because not to blow any trumpet at all, but actually just so you know where I'm coming from. Because I think a lot of the experiences, obviously, like with all of us, the experiences, the things that I've been through have shaped the way I think. But I also think they're very relevant to how things are at the moment. So, I mean, the first thing I'd like to say is I had a very unhappy schooling. I was both dyslexic and dyspraxic. And had it not been for art, I would have actually fallen off the edge without any question. I wouldn't have been able to cope with it, with the education system as it was then, undiagnosed, but still very, very difficult in a Catholic school in Bradford. And it was actually, funnily enough, for me, the thing that really saved me was the fact that I was always creative and I was into drawing and painting from a very young age. And my Catholic upbringing meant that the theatre, if you like, of the Catholic Church affected me greatly. And that went down really well with the nuns and people who I was always drawing endless crucifixions for. So that's school apart. I think my real education started at the age of 16 when I joined the Labour Party in 1970. And I joined the Labour Party Young Socialists, and from the Labour Party Young Socialists, I went on to join Militant and actually got to know Roger for the first time. So that means we go back quite a long way. And Ed as well, not far behind that, although we didn't meet very often. I remember him well. And John Dunn, for that matter, attending a YS conference. I think it was in Skegness. We've talked about this before, but I get my places mixed up. Anyway, the thing is, my real education, the beginnings of me feeling articulate and feeling confident as a young person was in the Labour movement. And at that time, in the early 70s in Bradford, there were still things like the Socialist Sunday School. There was an active Workers' Educational Association branch. The Labour movement felt real and it felt alive, for all it might have been still in the hands of the right wing, as it was at that time, so it's regionally and locally. There was a good left-wing voice, and the reading and things that people, you know, the standard books, Ragged Trousered Philanthropists, Jack London, A.J. Cronin, Zola, all of these people, as I gained in confidence. I wasn't able, incidentally, to read a book until the age of 12. So for me, when I joined the Labour Party at the age of 16, I really was ready to fill out my education. There was a moment, I worked in factories, but my heart and soul was in art, and I wanted to get into art college if I possibly could. And I'm sad to say that the comrades in Bradford, a lot of them weren't sympathetic. And I was actually asked at one stage, "Are you a Picasso?" And I said, "Well, no, I don't think I'm a Picasso." And this person said to me, who I really respected, "Well, if you're not a Picasso, you belong back on the factory floor, and that's where you should stay," which was a great shame, but also a sign of the fact that, you know, there were few people on the factory floor and they didn't want to lose somebody to art college, but that's where I went. And when I finished art college, for nearly 20 years, not straight away, but within a short distance of time, running an art centre, a community art centre, getting people involved in community arts, I was given the opportunity to develop and start the Bradford Festival. And I think what the knack that I brought to that, and the knack that I actually developed, which has held me in good stead for a long time with everything I've done, including more recently Bradford Transformed, was an ability to see, if you like, an overview of the city and the possible links of different community groups. Bradford's very multicultural, but not all of the groups necessarily met together or worked together or collaborated. And what the festival presented was this kind of huge opportunity. And it was probably, if I say so myself, and there were lots of other people worked on it, it was probably the best community geared festival in the country in the 90s. And we did bring all of these communities, the Caribbean, the European, the Asian, the Irish, the European communities in Bradford, all of them got involved in the festival and started to cross over with one another and get involved with one another's programs and things. There was one big event that we did called the Bradford Mailer, which is like the Asian equivalent of a festival. And that actually attracted something like 120,000 people over a weekend in Bradford. So the festival really touched a lot of people. And it also meant that things like some of the more, if you like, in this discussion, I can call them more right-wing communities, but that's not a fair description. But, you know, some of the European communities like the Poles and the Ukrainians and the Latvians and people who had a sort of conservatism because of what, you know, their fathers, their mothers and themselves had been through to get to be free of what they saw as of Russian dominance, they actually started to attend things like the Bradford Mailer, because we'd bring a troupe of people from the Ukraine and they'd perform at the Mailer as well as the Ukrainian club. And so the mix of audiences and people coming together really worked. And that festival was a terrific experience for me. The Tories got control of Bradford in 2001, and they gave the festival contract after nearly 20 years to an outside company from Brighton who went bankrupt within 2 years. But we were all out of work and I was so angry. I wanted to stand for council, but I was kind of independent by then, really. I think I was out of the Labour Party because of what was going on with Blair and everything like that. And I'm not very far off just explaining this background to you, which I think you'll understand was relevant as we go through the discussion. So I turned back to art, basically. I was made redundant, I lost my home, and I turned back to art. I met Mandy, my partner, who was a great Leonard Cohen fan, and she played Leonard Cohen for me, and I started to paint, and I painted them for the next 20 years up to now, and it saved my life. I do believe that art does save lives, and it certainly saved mine. And I've had a very rewarding time as a pastel painter, painting the sea, painting the lighthouses that my dad used to paint and decorate when I was a child, around Cornwall, where we lived for 15 years, and now moving back to Bradford. It was in 2015 when Corbyn got elected that I came back into the Labour Party. The first meeting I attended was of Falmouth branch, and it was down on the docks, where the working class people ran their little yachts and rowing boats and everything, workers, like a working men's club on the edge of Falmouth. And the membership of Falmouth Labour Party went from something like 28 to 800 in the space of a couple of weeks. And the meeting in the in that yacht, I'm calling it a yacht club, but it wasn't a fancy yacht club, in the boat club, was like charged and was absolutely full of oomph and people wanting and advocating great change. But of course, over the months, 800, there weren't 800 people at the meeting, instead there was about 250, 300 people. But over the months, the inevitable Labour Party kind of way of doing things, agendas and treasurer's reports and boring items for people, didn't hold people enough, and people drifted away. And you know, you were back to your kind of 30 people at a meeting. When I moved back to Bradford, I got involved, which was my own city. I got involved in Shipley Labour Party, the neighbouring constituency to the Free Bradford ones, and and became involved in Bradford Transformed. I was really wanting to do something that was different to an average Labour Party meeting. I'm not saying there aren't some good ones, and haven't been some good ones in the past, where speakers have been there and resolutions have been passed and things like that, but generally to do something a bit more exciting. So we cottoned on to what the World Transformed was doing through Momentum and formed a Bradford Transformed branch. And we started to do all sorts of things: film nights, book clubs, cycling clubs, meetings on things like universal credit, working in collaboration with people like the Cuban Solidarity Campaign. All sorts of people used Bradford Transform to have a variety of types of meetings and gatherings. But COVID did cut across that. During COVID, we actually did, and no thanks to my limited technology, as Dave Buxton will qualify, we did actually do a 4-hour festival live on Facebook and through a TV studio, community TV studio in Bradford, and actually got people like John McDonald, Laura Pidcock, Ian Lavery, Sarah Woolley from the Bakers Union, Richard Bergen. All of these people came or did things over the air into the studio and took part in the festival. But we also had music and art and different things, talks on books that have been published recently and things like that as part of a 4-hour festival. And it was really successful. So apart from one other thing that I want to talk about, because I think, again, it's going to affect things, on and off in my life, I have suffered through depression. And I'm happy to say that I haven't been in that depressed state now for some years, really. But what I did know about depression and what I found out, and has left me with a great empathy for people who have mental problems with their health, is that when you're full of stress and anxiety or depression, your mind closes down. You can't think outside the box. You catastrophize and you see things in a particular way. And I say that because I actually think that's been writ large right across all of our communities in recent years by what's happened to people's lives. And it's no wonder at one level why there's so much confusion, and certainly why mental health is off the scale. Obviously, what's going down now in the late stage, I hope the late stages of capitalism, and certainly the last, the culmination of some 30, 40 years of neoliberalism practiced on the people of this country and of lots of other countries around the world, has created a dysfunctional society. It's created a dystopia, and the dystopia is growing. And it's not hard to see the effects that that's having on people, but also it's also waking people up, I think, because the corruption, the absolute rottenness of the way things are done and being organised is beginning to show through. And I do think people are waking up to that. Lots of professionals. I've got a young, well, she's not that young now, she's 30 odd, but my daughter, relatively young by my standards, trained to be a teacher, and she entered the teaching profession just as all of that dysfunction has got to, it's kind of, people just want out of some of these jobs, and the vocation has been knocked out of people. So it's a massive kind of problem going on here, and it's permeated its way through everything, through all institutions. They've all been corrupted. The visionaries and people have been taken out of the tops of things, like, if they ever were there in the first place, but certainly in education, in health. The people who believe passionately in these services, in even public service, have been removed, and they've been replaced, and the management structures are corrupt, and the people at the bottom, the foot soldiers, the nurses, the teachers, the people who do the real jobs, are left with a dysfunctional system with ridiculous kind of monitoring of what they do, tons of paperwork, and they basically go balmy over that. In schools, we've actually seen that creativity has been is slowly but surely being wiped off the agenda, when we know full well that it's creativity that actually spurs young minds on to do greater things, the kind of things that Ed was talking about earlier when he opened the meeting. And the other thing that's happened in that time since I first joined the Labour Party is that lots of working class institutions, the working men's clubs, the pubs, lots of things have disappeared. The trade union branches aren't quite as active, although there is now signs of real revitalisation there. But nonetheless, it means that the mainstream media, and also the letdown of Labour governments who have failed to tackle things like deindustrialisation, failed to, in many ways, complemented what Thatcher has done to our country, and Reagan did to America. The way that these people have actually been bolstered up by a mainstream media that is as lying and conniving as could possibly be. So it's no wonder that there's confusion out there. It's no wonder there's confusion over so many issues, and it's no wonder that there's the mental health problems that I was talking about that are growing, where lots of young people see their lives as being hopeless, where for the first time we actually say that maybe, that people's living standards and ways of living are not improving, that we're actually going backwards, that students are being saddled by debt, whereas people of my generation got free education. And so on. So that's the kind of situation that we see. But despite all of that, and of course globally, massive movements and governments overthrown and general strikes called in different countries, often unreported in the British media, but absolutely, a world that is being shook by this conflict between a capitalist system that now wants to rob people of any sense of decent living and claw back all it can in terms of provision for people, is leaving people without. Nonetheless, we see actually a growth in the movements that are around, things like Black Lives Matter, things like LGBT rights, the Extinction Rebellion movement, campaigns like John's with Orgreave, that despite all of this, there's still a growing strength amongst working people, despite the disillusionment. And it's what we do with that now that really, really matters. I also think of people like Marcus Rushford, the footballer, and him actually gaining public support to actually make sure that young kids were fed during school holidays. Those things are small victories, but there's more victories coming on the way as well, with trade unions winning better wage agreements and, holding out for better, I think there's a collapse going on, just as politically the Labour Party has aligned itself with the Tories and even merging itself almost with the Tories at the moment, if that's not too exaggerated to say, that people are looking for other ways of actually struggling and fighting the system. So, and the other thing that I think is really interesting, that I don't think, because we often think of politics and things in terms of people voting or, gaining majorities, I think we also ought to understand that kind of idea of the zeitgeist and the moment, that actually things can change so easily. The Arab Springs, the moments that can actually change consciousness in people on a massive scale, that kind of atmosphere is going to grow in this world where people are getting polarized, so that more and more things could happen. Do you know what I'm just aware of now? We're about halfway through, but we did have about 20 slides that Dave has really, maybe 25, that we're just going to flick through. I just want to show you these before we go on to discuss what we can do and what I think the powers of the arts are. So they're random, and they're things that have just stuck in my memory. So we're opening with some shots of Eisenstein's film and poster for Battleship Potemkin, which was, when I went to art college, was one of the first films that we saw in film studies, and it left a real lasting impression with me. There's about 3 images here that show that. This is a film that was made in 1925, and this is the Russian White Guard firing on the demonstrators and people who've come to support the mutiny on the Battleship Potemkin and the massacre that ensued. These kind of films had a massive effect on consciousness, and would have in Russia, 5 years after the revolution, or 6 years after the revolution, would have reminded people all too clearly of where they'd come from. If we could move on, so that's the end of Potemkin. Another person that we looked at, these are some early Labour movement posters, and I juxtapose these in my mind with these really bland corporate presentations that you see now at party conferences. Even under Corbyn, I think the officials must have kept control on this kind of, there's no art in the Labour movement in how it projects itself at elections or whatever. But these early posters, if you could move on, Dave, of Mothers Vote Labour, of creating a new dawn, of yesterday the trenches, today the unemployed, must have really struck home to people, and really, they did to me even as a young man, and that was like 40 odd years after, more than 40 years after these posters. These are from the 1920s as well. An important person was John Hartfield, who mastered photomontage, had to leave Germany, and began to use his art to show the evils of fascism. And if you move on with Hitler, here he is with his X-ray chest filled with the coins of the rich. And the next one, I think, is the beast of capitalism walking over the dead of the First World War. And this one, which I seem to remember, was a poster called "Millions Are Behind Us," and it shows the boss, if you like, feeding the raised hand of Hitler and funding the rise of fascism. Charlie Chaplin in the film The Great Dictator, you know, really amazingly dealing with all of that in a different way, but in a very powerful way. Now, if we move on, Guernica by Picasso. I'm going to go quite quickly through these, if that's okay. I should have actually shown you them just a little bit further back. Trade union banners. As I joined the Labour Party, one of the first big exhibitions I saw was Banner Bright, and this celebration of, and then also seeing these banners. I never actually got to Durham Miners Gala. I hope to go if it's on this year live. I do hope to go to it. But I saw them at Wakefield, at the Wakefield Miners Gala, when Arthur Scargill was speaking, and thousands were in the park. And these banners really speak to a sense of unity, a sense of pride. And if we move on, Dave, this a more recent one, there seems to have been a real growth now in people using the traditions of those banners to create more contemporary banners that mean things to communities. And there's a wonderful shot of Durham Miners Gala with the brass bands and people, the banners. Ken Loach, I think, an amazing filmmaker. I, Daniel Blake, and also an amazing man to stand up courageously against Starmer and to call him out in the way in which he did recently. But dealing with issues like Sorry We Missed You, dealing with 0 hours contracts, dealing with life on universal credit, those recent films have really, I think, and will continue to hit home with people, as does the tradition going right back to Poor Cow and Cathy Come Home. He's a really prolific film writer, maker. The Wind That Shakes the Barley, looking at the troubles in Ireland and the events up to and around 1922. And then also another good film, Land and Freedom, about the Spanish Civil War. So these are powerful heritage items for the Labour movement, but also indicate the kind of the strength of it. Banksy is another person who I think is really quite incredible. Follow Your Dreams, Cancelled. These wall pieces of wall art are really so powerful. The child actually frisking the soldier and disarming him. And here we have an amazing, I'd love to see this place in Palestine, in Bethlehem, I think. He opened a hotel as a collaboration with others called the Waldorf Hotel. And it actually works as an hotel. It's a boutique hotel. It's full of art and it's full of protest. And it's right next, if you move to the next slide, you can see exactly where it is. It's looking out on the walls that the Israeli government have put there on the West Bank. These people are, sorry, thank you, Dave. If we go on now, the next one. These people, I think, really affect my kind of imagination. They're called the Red Rebel Brigade, and they're springing up now. They started in Bristol with the XR movement. I think it was Bristol, and they really have. If you've seen them on film, they're quite amazing, because you'll get things like a police cordon of a street and demonstrators approaching that way, and the police are holding solid. And then just out of a side street will come this troop of almost like mime artists. They don't talk, but they actually create a different presence. They actually disarm the kind of potential of violence. The police don't know what to do with these people, but this is a really good example of art being used to, if you like, to diffuse, to show solidarity, and to also raise awareness. If we could move on. Just now, a few memes from social media. This quote from Steve Biko, as always, I thought is so important. The most potent weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And how true that is, and how much that is what, in a sense, I'm hoping out of this discussion, that's what we're looking at. That's what we're thinking about, how to change that, how to change the mind of the oppressed. I tried to show the way in which social media, because I think there's some just amazing memes that come up every day almost on social media. The idea of one of the images that sticks out in my mind that I was hoping to show was one of a large fish going after small fish. And then suddenly the small fish forming the shape of a larger fish than the big fish and actually going after it. And I think those kind of images, that kind of use of art is powerful, and it resonates with people. And the right wing and the Tories and right wing Labour, these people can't even begin to put their creative, though they haven't got creative minds, so they can't begin to create alternatives to these kind of demonstrations of solidarity and agitation and propaganda. There's moments, there was a moment in 1981. I think art helps us identify with one another and expands our notion of we from the local to the global. But he really writes well on the arts and the power of the arts. And I'm certainly going to spend more time after today, looking at what he has to say. But I'm just going to reel off some of the things that I think the arts can bring to the struggle and to the struggle for socialism. They bring their own autonomy and power. Capitalism, despite its attempts to actually own and control the arts, doesn't really, it exploits them. It can use them to create rarefied moments and a sense of elitism. It exploits them for cash. It isn't bothered about celebrities or artists in particular. In fact, sometimes it suits capitalism better that artists are actually dead. And that the value of what they did actually rises because of the way in which capitalism works. So they bring their own autonomy and power. They reach deep into the human psyche. They draw on our collective history. They spur the imagination. They create beauty and pleasure and bring meaning into our lives. They communicate and change perceptions. They think out of the box and the narrow confines that capitalism would prefer them to be in. They move, stir, excite the emotions. They bring people together in shared experiences. They have a universal language. They have a power to help bring about social change and so to change the world. They help us to evolve our understanding and our culture. Really, powerful meanings to art here. And I just want to, again, I'll be very quickly reading these, but it's going to help me to read them rather than just try and redigest them. Just some very small paragraphs of thought, sentences of thought that I took from some of the reading I was trying to do for today. Art resides within, and not necessarily attributed to anybody, but could be found on the net. Art resides with everyone's inner child. It thrives in a state of flow. It blossoms the drive to understand oneself, revere the mysteries of life. It nurtures human need to bring forth balance and harmony. It aligns with the natural cycles of creation and love. Another one, when we experience a work of art through a painting, a photograph, video, film, a poem, plays, or a song, we discover that we are moved and changed. When we enable the messages to reach us, we evolve. We often take for granted how much in everyday life we encounter and interact with art in some form. We choose the songs that are most relevant to our current mood at home and on the way to work. We quote the words we hear and read, and they become our life mantra. We constantly inspire one another creatively by sharing images of beauty, hope, optimism, contributing to collective powers that bring forward positive reform. And you may attend a rally, it says here, vote, but you also read books, listen to music, engage with visual art, turn on the radio and create your identity through culture. Artists are central, not peripheral, to social change. To have the movements that make the wave, you need cultural workers. You'll have all heard of Simon Sharma, another one that I'll just read out briefly. We're plowing through this now. I hope I'm not going too fast and that people are getting something out of it. But he says, the power of the greatest art is the power to shake us into revelation and rip us from our default mode of seeing. After an encounter with that force, we don't look at a face, a colour, a sky, a body in quite the same way again. We get fitted with new sight, insight, visions of beauty, or a rush of intense pleasure are part of that process. But so too may be shock, pain, desire, pity, even revulsion. That art seems to have rewired our senses. We apprehend the world differently. And in terms of art in schools and creativity with young people, it's reckoned that, you know, obviously that creates creativity, it creates confidence, it creates problem solving, it creates perseverance, it creates focus, it creates non-verbal receiving and collaboration developing. I'll stop reading out some of those things and move very quickly on to some of the meat of what I was trying to say. So the other thing I'd just like to say is, if you imagine that the arts can do all of those things in a dystopia, what would they do in a socialist world? What would they do in a world where there were no longer any wars, where the negative atmosphere that fills the world with everything from the pillaging of the world's resources, the ruining of ecosystems, forests and oceans, the poverty, the starvation caused by war, the famine, the mental health of people in the West and all over the world trying to hold it together, trying to hold their domestic together. If you imagine all of that toxicity, even today, those things create, I believe, an atmosphere in the world is actually anxiety and stress. That's the weight, the hopeless, futile weight that capitalism has put on this planet. And when we're finally relieved of that, I honestly believe we'll see a massive blossoming of creativity and understanding of cooperation, where things like racism and all the things that bigotry, all of these things would slide into the background. They're not necessarily human qualities, but they can certainly be brought out by divide and rule politics and the way in which capitalism looks to scapegoat its own weaknesses on ordinary people. Just two or three things now, very briefly. I'm going to leave some of the things I think we can do, but I'd like to see in what's happening at the moment, certainly in Britain, I can only imagine it's similar in America and places like that and Europe, that I'd like to see the trade union movement, certainly in Britain. I think the trade union movement at the moment has the impetus. You know, the Labour Party is doing very little. Obviously, we want to see the rise of shadow CLPs and things, and we're all working towards combating Labour's chronic state of affairs. But I'd like to see actually the trade unions diverting some of their political levies into things like after-school activities, into youth clubs, into communities, into things happening, into developing skills, into building orchestras, into making banners, into actually creating an energy on the council estates and wherever that actually brings people in and makes them feel like they're part of something worthwhile. And I think that's really entirely possible at the moment. And we need to push for it. The arts can only the arts can not only play a central role in changing the world and in the struggle for socialism, but they can also help to shape and relieve people of the oppressive way in which they've been living, so that people are fit to live in a different world. So the arts are so vital in every sense to the future of what we're doing. And, you know, to finish, I'm forever reminded of Rosa Luxemburg's 100 years ago, Socialism or Barbarism. It's taken 100 years more, and the agony of living under capitalism is painful for everybody and has caused all sorts of people, as I said at the beginning, to live unfulfilled lives and not actually achieve what they, you know, their one true, you know, life on this planet. So I'm going to finish with something I saw on a meme yesterday, and it's an unknown author, and it's just basically this. It says, an old Cherokee told his grandson, "My son, there is a battle between two wolves inside of us all. One evil, it is anger, jealousy, greed, resentment, inferiority, lies, and ego. The other is good. It is joy, peace, love, hope, humility, kindness, empathy, and truth." The boy thought about it and asked, "Grandfather, which wolf wins?" The old man quietly replied, "The one you feed." And I think for me, that kind of summed up when I saw that. I thought, oh my God, that's where we're at, and that's what we need to do. And I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Alan. That was absolutely brilliant. Really, really, really interesting and thought-provoking. I'm sure there'll be lots of comrades wanting to come into the discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to ask comrades to raise their hands. Trinity's iPad first.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
It's John. When we look at the history of the labour movement in Britain, we tend to think of, if you like, the massive gains that were made at the end of the Second World War, you know, nationalisations, the creation of the health service, etc. As far as I'm concerned, another gain that was made and isn't talked about very often is the gains in education, particularly adult education. We had the creation, I don't know when it was founded, but the Workers' Education Association went into a whole load of different areas. The facts that when I was growing up, the secondary schools in our area were all given over at night to doing all sorts of activities for people who'd left school. These were, you know, some of them were vocational in the sense of it was English and woodwork, etc. But then there was languages, etc. And also, I was on the council in Manchester for a number of years, and I was involved with the music service. And one item on an agenda that really struck me was a league table of music services in Britain, you know, different local authorities. And two local authorities in particular struck me. One was Kingston upon Hull, which had a budget, I'm going back 30 years now, a budget of about 180,000 for its music service. And next to it was Kingston upon Thames, which had a budget for its music service of 0. So when you got the posh areas, and Kingston upon Thames is a posh area because I've lived down in that part of London, they just left it to private individuals who could afford music and tuition, etc. But when it came to, if you like, that municipal socialism that was talked about, it was the Labour authorities that put money into music services. As being involved in the music service in Manchester, we had a situation where we had a whole plethora of orchestras, brass bands, swing bands. We even had a balalaika ensemble because we had certain Stalinists in the Labour group who wanted to make sure that Russia was represented. But there was a whole plethora of these services, and they involved from tiny tots through to elderly people, so that you had you'd have an orchestra that had a whole age range involved in it. Well, Blair came in, and Blair decided to rectify the inequalities in the music services in Britain. So he then said that all music services will be funded by the government, which he thought, well, yes, that's a good idea. But having funded the music services, he then, or not he, but the Labour government then decided that the music services should be solely for schools. So all the orchestras that involved people with years of experience and all the choirs and all the bands, etc., were then disbanded by the council, because the council had been, if you like, running them. So, and then it went over to, if you like, just schools, and then cuts came in and the schools lost money in that sort of direction. Or, you know, it wasn't like it was previously. And again, with higher, if you like, we say community education, we found that there was a massive cut in community services for adult education, and it went more and more to vocational training, i.e., if you were running a course or the council was funding a course, it had to have a job at the end. Whereas education after the war was for education's sake. It was to broaden the mind. It was to develop, you know, so that, if you like, that sort of semi-revolutionary thing that had caused the creation of the health service, the nationalisation of the major utilities, etc. You know, there was that thing, and I think, sorry, I forget his name, the guy who was speaking,
ALLAN.
You know, sort of summed it up, that it was a destruction, you know, by both Labour and Tory governments, you know, this neoliberalism, that all that you're there for is to provide a job, you know, and education for education's sake, you know, is largely gone. So I'd just like to leave it at that.
Thank you very much, John. Next speaker is Roger Silverman.
First of all, I'd like to say I think Alan's talk was absolutely inspirational. It was brilliant, it was refreshing, it was original, it was everything that we expected of him. I'd like to make a few points about the role of the arts in revolution. Impending social storms are always foreshadowed in the arts. Art, music, literature, drama, etc. They're always, of course, innovative, because that's what creativity means. But in such times, in times of revolution, they're actually iconoclastic. The first portents of revolution are always a stirring within the intelligentsia, and especially the youth. Art and literature reflect and foreshadow crisis and conflict. And the 20th century, which is after all the most violent and traumatic in history so far, saw every kind of artistic rebellion in art, poetry, literature, music, drama, cinema. The old forms and structures and rules made no sense to their creators in an epoch of catastrophe. There were even poets like Kurt Schwitters in Germany and Khlyabnikov and Kruchonych in Russia, who literally invented a new nonsense language composed of meaningless syllables. And of course, musicians like John Cage, who wrote music with no notes. But these freak creations matched the turmoil of the times. Alan mentioned Picasso's Guernica, which after all, it conveys the horror of fascism or war far more effectively than any photo or realistic representation could have done. He also mentioned Battleship Potemkin, and there the images will remain forever on anybody who's seen it, of the maggot-infested meat that was served up to the sailors and the massacre on the Odessa steppes. Then you've got things like the grotesque caricatures of George Grosz, who was a contemporary of John Hartfield, in Germany, which give us an instant insight into a decadent society lurching towards counter-revolution. Though I'm thinking also of people like Diego Rivera in Mexico, who spent 10 years painting a mural on the walls of the National Palace, which was really about the history of the peasants and the workers of Mexico, and included representations of Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky. And many Western writers during the madness of the 20th century in Europe, people like Kafka, Ionesco, Beckett, they created an entirely new genre that incorporated the madness of the world around them into their art and literature. I wanted to mention, for instance, surrealism, the 20th century artistic movement, which grew up at a time when artists felt that normal civilized life had come undone in conditions of world war, civil war, revolution, and counter-revolution. And wanting to face up to these new terrifying realities and to mock those who clung on to self-delusion and hypocrisy, they used realistic techniques to portray the world as crazy and bizarre, where dreams and nightmares were, in a sense, truer than everyday life. Salvador Dali painted psychotic fantasies. Escher drew logically impossible sketches. And in literature and drama, nonsensical or nightmarish events are acted out as if they were completely normal everyday occurrences. In Kafka's Metamorphosis, an office worker wakes up one morning to find he's turned into a giant cockroach. In Beckett's Waiting for Godot, two tramps stand by a roadside waiting forever for a meeting that never happens. In Ionesco's Rhinoceros, which is an allegory about the rise of fascism, each of the characters, one by one, turns into a rhinoceros. In Frisch's play, The Arsonists, a respectable bourgeois is too polite to stop a gang of arsonists burning down his house. And you think all this is just absurd, but what, after all, could be more grotesque and surreal than the Nazi Holocaust, the Stalinist show trials, or the atom bomb on Hiroshima? And doesn't Kafka's The Trial seem almost commonplace compared to the Moscow trials? So I wanted to give those sort of examples. The Russian Revolution liberated the creative energies of a whole generation. The youth were thrown into turmoil by the World War, followed by a decade of dizzying upheavals, the Revolution, the Civil War, the rise of Stalinism. And the first years of the revolution gave a tremendous impetus to artistic experimentation. And artistic freedom in the days of the Bolsheviks flourished as never before or since. Theatre, cinema, poetry, music, art, and sculpture sprang up and touched the lives of the masses everywhere. I just wanted to make a point about the attitude of Lenin and Trotsky to these trends. First of all, the Bolsheviks defended to the death the absolute right of artistic and literary freedom. At the same time, they didn't always fully agree with the more extreme of these literary pioneers. Lenin expressed a kind of avuncular irritation with those who demanded the instant creation of a proletarian culture. For a start, he said, we'd be happy enough to get a decent bourgeois culture. And that was, after all, a reasonable aspiration on the terrain of a peasant country still hobbling along on the technology of the medieval wooden plough amid a fog of feudal superstition and mass illiteracy. And Trotsky, too, engaged in gentle mockery of the more exotic elements in the contemporary wave of artistic experimentation. He said, for instance, to be sure, a young futurist, referring to the futurist movement at the time, to be sure, a young futurist didn't go to the factories and to the mills, but he made a lot of noise in cafes, he banged his fist upon music stands, he put on a yellow blouse, he painted his cheeks, and he threatened vaguely with his fist. But despite all this mockery, he explicitly acknowledged the absolute necessity at times of even the most flamboyant gestures to the further development of cultural life. He insisted, another quote, every new artistic or literary tendency has begun with the scandal, breaking the old respected crockery, bruising many established authorities. This flowed not at all from publicity seeking, although there was no lack of this. No, these people, artists as well as literary critics, had something to say. They had friends, they had enemies, they fought, and exactly through this, they demonstrated the right to exist. he did argue against the impatience of some futurists for the instant overthrow of the old culture. And again, just one more quote. To say that futurism has freed art of its 1,000-year-old bonds of bourgeoisdom is to estimate thousands of years very cheaply. The call of the futurists to break with the past, to do away with Pushkin, to liquidate tradition, etc., has a meaning insofar as it's addressed to the old literary caste, to the closed-in circle of the intelligentsia. But the meaninglessness of this call becomes evident as soon as it's addressed to the proletariat. The working class does not have to and cannot break with literary tradition because the working class is not in the grip of such tradition. The working class doesn't know the old literature. It still has to commune with it. It still has to master Pushkin to absorb him and so overcome him. But nevertheless, that's the end of that quote, but just a point. It's noteworthy that even during the privations of the early 1920s, for all their reservations, Lenin and Trotsky willingly endorsed the publication at state expense of the full range of artistic output. And there's actually a marginal annotation in the minutes of one of their meetings by Lenin, where they fully endorsed the publication at state expense, as I said of this, but as Lenin put it, for the sake of cranks and charlatans. And the point being that even the most outlandish of tastes, even the cranks and charlatans, were still in those days provided for without question. I've got a lot more to say, but I don't want to take up any more time on that, of the absolutely implacable defense of artistic freedom by Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolsheviks. But of course, exactly by the same token, Stalin, one of the most fundamental and decisive things in the counter-revolution under Stalin was the suppression of any kind of artistic talent. I don't know if perhaps I won't say any more on that now because I had some other points to make. But I mean, this discussion is absolutely one of the most creative and original that we've had, and I want to give plenty of time for other people to come in. But I do think that we need to spend a little more attention sometimes on cultural and artistic, on the cultural side, if you like, of the struggle. And both in these meetings and I hope in the pages of On the Brink, we'll have a lot more articles and attention given to that, including, of course, absolutely articles by Comrade Allan. So thanks, comrades.
Okay, thank you very much, Roger. The next speaker in the discussion is Steve.
Hi, comrades. Thanks for having this important meeting. And I agree with Roger. Art and culture is, for Marxists, for the working class, are critical. And I think that especially in the rise of fascism, what we face globally. And one of the things, there are a number of points. I mean, I think that the working class movement, the trade unions have not really supported and funded culture and arts. I know in Korea, the first time I was there, the Koreans have a national day, the unions, to commemorate John Dae-il, one of the founders of the Korean labor movement, where they have art troupes and musicians, artists, poets come to the stadium for a whole day of choreographed production of artists, cultural workers, poets, comedy, comedians, which is very powerful. And they support dancers. The unions, KCTU actually supports a dance troupe, which I put a link to it. I interviewed one of the dancers. But in general, in the United States, the unions do not support artists. And like in Britain, the union, they support millions of dollars to the Democrats in the United States and virtually nothing to culture and arts. So that has to be fought for in the unions. The other thing, very important thing, is youth and the internet, because through the internet, young people, young workers, particularly Black youth, are able to express themselves and get their stories out. And the Black Lives Matter movement, the mass protests, brought a proliferation of art and culture in the United States, in Minneapolis, many other places. During the time of the pandemic, in the rebellions, there were artists, many murals that were produced and throughout the country, expressing the working class, expressing the youth. And we have a thing called Labor Fest, laborfest.net, every July, to have culture, arts. If you go to, I'll put the link in, where we can have discussions, presentations, artists, contribution. The other thing that we have been involved in San Francisco is the fight to defend artists who've come under attack by identity politics. There's a Victor Arnautoff, who was a communist who worked with the ILW, the Longshore Union, and did murals and art. And his murals came under attack. They were the only murals in the United States exposing the role of George Washington as a slaveholder and as a supporter of expansion of American imperialism. The murals are at the George Washington High. And identity politics supporters, I would call them rightists, wanted to tear down the mural, spend $800,000 to destroy this mural. So there was a whole fight in San Francisco to defend the art. And these murals, painted mostly by left communist artists, are in the 30s, are coming under attack in this period. So, and then you have the fight against Confederate art that has been put up to dominate the Black working class, particularly in the South, and that fight against that. So these historical questions of art are very important for the working class. And one of the things Trump said, well, if you take down, Lee's statue, maybe you'll have to take down Jefferson's statue and George Washington's statue. So this debate about art and what should be presented and what art represents is critical for the working class. It's a theoretical question, it's a political question, and it's a way of engaging young people in the struggle for art and to defend artists who are starving now. I mean, the art community has been devastated, and the conditions of the United States are reprehensible. So that's something we have to fight for and build an artists union and artist movement. So that's what we try to do in our rallies and our actions that we have. Bring in artists, songs, and music as part of, an integral part of the struggle. Thank you. Comrades.
Thank you very much, Steve. The next speaker in the discussion is Matt.
No, I think it's right what comrades have said. That actually, of course, I mean, in these terms, art is essential to the evolution of any revolutionary notion of the world, and of course itself is a means of looking at the essence of the human condition and human experience. And as Roger said, a huge explosion of art every time, artistic creativity every time you have any kind of move to change the society. As has been said, I don't know who exactly said it, obviously that revolution is the carnival of the oppressed, and that of course applies particularly to culture and art. I mean, what comrades said previously, obviously you have people like, you talk of the prolet cult and so on, as Bogdanov, a man who obviously had a huge influence in various ways and managed to kill himself, experimenting on himself with blood transfusions. But, again, I mean, who was actually then obviously basically allowed to proceed by Lenin, Trotsky, etc., despite the fact, of course, they wildly disagreed with it. And you look at somebody like Mayakovsky. I mean, Mayakovsky, probably one of the dominant artists of the Russian Revolution. As a young man arrested before the First World War by the Tsarist secret police, and writes to his sister and said, "Bring me, I'm in jail. Bring me some art materials and a copy of Capital Volume 1, so I can study both art and Marx," which he did for the rest of his life. So you have that in those terms, but it's then it then of course obviously winds up in this contradiction at the moment, and I mean people talk of obviously Luxemburg said barbarism or socialism, and I think there's a good case for saying we have barbarism now. So we see obviously a contrast between, as Steve has pointed out, the condition of actual artists attempting to create art at the moment, and of course the capitalist class, then speculating in art, and using their wealth to deny art to the rest of the population. I mean, our struggle should be to make art all art freely available to the population, obviously as part of the inheritance of all of humanity. That you know, we're surprised. I mean, it goes down to Russian revolutionary art. I mean, now Russian revolutionary art, which of course is created in the service of the revolution and is explicitly anti-capitalist, much of it, is now worth a fortune. It's now been bought up by capitalists in a sort of ludicrous way. The other thing, of course, is that I think the other tendency at the moment, which I think needs to be exposed, is of course the sort of official art, if you like, the products of Hollywood and all this other stuff, the sort of official culture and art of the bourgeoisie, of course, is now becoming stripped of all content. It has nothing to say. It has no insight. The bourgeoisie does not wish insight. It does not wish to examine the human condition. It wishes to say, you know, as little as it possibly can. So it creates this vacuous stuff and feeds it to you know, great volume to the mass of people, always as a means of stultification, of anaesthetising people. And we should struggle against this also. So this is crap, and B, we stand in favour of art which actually says something, has some real insight into the conditions of humanity and society as a whole, and that's essential. And clearly, it is for this, among other things, of course. I mean, obviously, the parasitic nature of the bourgeoisie, also extends to art, and really, it's about cleaning these people out. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Matt. Next speaker is John Dunn.
That were absolutely brilliant, Alan. It was one of the best lead-offs I've ever heard in years. And the whole question of art is something that, the left in particular never wants to discuss. We'll discuss, revolutions, we'll discuss social movements, but there's nothing that exemplifies the contradictions in society more than art. You've got at the upper layers, Matt mentioned some of this, you've got, art as a commodity, whereas because, capitalism's failing, the super rich, are paying hundreds of millions of pounds for grand masters, many of which were painted by people who died in absolute poverty. And you get cult artists who are embraced by these people. The people like Damien Hirst, who never paints a thing, never does a thing. He employs people on 0 hours contracts on national minimum wage to do his stuff. But at the other end of it, you've got, we're surrounded by art. Every time, you see a wondrous building, magnificent architecture, supposedly built by Sir Christopher Wren or somebody like that. But people created that stonemasons with their own labour, with their bare hands, and I had the fortune in recent years to actually organise a travelling art exhibition. I suppose that made me the curator of a good friend of mine, Darren Caulfield. And we toured this artwork around, a lot of it was about our great strike, and we toured it around areas that were connected to it, Wakeley Hall, the WEA, places where, the NUM had held its education courses. But when we wanted to go a little bit wider with it, we hit the problem, the sort of thing you talked about, adult education no longer deals with this, but the very problem of hiring community halls that are extortionate, and you've got to do risk assessments, you've got to pay an insurance, and we wanted an exhibition that people could get up close to and touch and feel, and, we just couldn't get anywhere, but we're surrounded. You mentioned trade union banners, are always awestruck in Durham, at Red Hills, the headquarters of the Durham miners, with that display of banners. The NUM headquarters in Barnsley, pure genius works of art that are sometimes never even thought of as art. We have a thriving working class art. You know, artists, people like Joe Solo, who does an incredible job, and who the establishment really lengthily tried to put out of business, although it never, you know, it never earns a penny. Everything's for good causes, by labeling him an anti-Semite because he was showing solidarity through his art with people like Chris Williamson. And the biggest problem that our class has is time. You know, if you're stuck in a dead-end job, working 60 hours a week, coming home exactly, you know, entirely knackered and almost unable to function, then you don't have time to think about art, let alone get involved in it. You know, my dad were a great example. When he finished work, when he retired, he took advantage of the NUN's early retirement scheme, and he taught himself woodworking because he loved work. He was a fitter in the pit. He loved working with his hands. And when people are liberated from the drudgery of work, that's when you see their, you know, their creativity. Why did our year-long strike produce lots of poets, lots of articulate people, painters, cartoonists and things? Because people had the time. And to me, that's the real thing that we need. It's tied up with the class struggle, shorter working hours, better working conditions, the things we used to call the social wage, decent pensions, decent benefits, but also access to public spaces, which is denied us now. Just try and hire a community hall and it's extortionate. But once again, Alan, absolutely brilliant. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, John. Yes, Karel, please speak.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alan. That was really, really inspirational this afternoon to hear you speak. Just a couple of points. They're not really linked to in a sort of a coherent point that I want to make. I just want to just say a few things. One of them is about Picasso's Guernica. I don't know if you know that when it was first shown outside of Spain, it was shown in Mile End in Whitechapel, and it was free. It was a free exhibition. They did ask people to donate a pair of boots to the cause, and hundreds of people from the East End queued up to see it, which I think is a really sweet little story. So I want to say something about education, because that's my background, and I worked in schools for nearly 40 years, 25 of them as a head teacher in primary schools. And I can honestly say to you that the arts in the public sector in schools are virtually non-existent. It is a great, great tragedy. The best school that I ever visited, because I did have an opportunity to be part of a project with Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Schools, was a private school in Cambridge. It was actually called Cambridge Prep School, and it had about 300 children in it. About 40 of them were boarders. And we went, a group of head teachers went to visit it with an HMI, a Majesty's Inspector. And the headmaster showed us around the school. And I can honestly say to you, the children had the most fantastic art education I'd ever seen. They had music for at least an hour a day. Every child played an instrument. Every child had singing, voice training. It was absolutely superb quality. They had access to art studios, to professional performing artists, etc. Of course, it all cost about 30 grand a year plus. And at the end of it, I mean, it just bowled you over. At the end of it, the headmaster, because I was very quiet throughout the day. I mean, if I say to you, they gave us lunch and they believed in dressed crab, and I didn't know what that was. But anyway, and he said to me, are you all right? And I said, no, I'm very sad. And he said, why? I said, because this is what every child should have. Every child deserves this. So I suppose in school, my own school, I really, really fought hard for the arts, because education should be not just what the Tories want it to be, which is maths, English and science. That's what they want it to be. Nothing else than that, because they're the subjects they can test, they can measure them. And it's a very, very big struggle to fight against that. We tried to do it, and I think we succeeded. I've been left the school about 6 years now, I've been retired. I know that, I mean, we did very well at Ofsted, got outstanding several times, and we did that not because we focused on those subjects, it's because we had the widest possible curriculum that we could have. And it was in a Conservative controlled authority, not a Labour controlled, but it's Labour now, but it was Tory, very Tory at the time. And when you had a good Ofsted, you'd get the leader of the council would come visit you and pat you on the head, sort of thing. And when he came, we had all the music going on, and he said, when he was leaving, he said, well, what is your inspiration? I took great delight in saying Simon Bolivar Youth Orchestra and watching the bastard's face fall. But anyway, yeah, art is a human right. And people have said about the unions, the fight in the union within and outside of the National Education Union is very much about stopping academisation, because in academies, it absolutely means that the curriculum is reduced smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller till it's, there's going to be no art at all, no music at all, no social sciences at all, just no languages. Language teaching is dying as well. And for most young people, art is very dear to their heart, and art can save your life. If you think that how many young people have joined the Anti-Nazi League, that's a very good example, joined the Anti-Nazi League in the late 70s and 80s because they loved black music, and they knew then that, the National Front, the lies they were spreading was also linked to the fact that those working class kids on those estates absolutely loved the music of Bob Marley, loved the reggae that came out of a very tiny island. How many fantastically talented people have come out of the tiny island of Jamaica? Hundreds and hundreds of musicians and artists. And they love the music of Tamla Motown. So, yeah, I agree with Alan, art can save your life. Thank you very much.
So thanks very much, Karel. We've got now Larry with his hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ed. What I'd like to, I appreciated the contribution, Alan, although I had to pop out for a second, and it's very informative, and enjoyed the direction you were taking. The art and development and direction, I've tried to look into some of the groups that are involved with art, specifically around people in the St. Ives group and things like that, where their art was developing, and it reflects politics really on the left, in as much as, I'm not saying these people were left wing, but it reflects the development of ideas, which leads to splits within different groups. And art reflects politics in that sense, particularly on the left. One of the things that I've always tried to encourage is the community arts. And one of the things that you mentioned in your first contribution, Ed, as chairing the meeting, was getting art into the working class. And one of the things that jumped into my mind was that I didn't appreciate it at the time, but on the Brandon estate in South East London is a great big statue and figure by Henry Moore, stuck in the working class areas in South East London. Why it's still there, I do not know. I'm given South East London, I'm surprised it's not been nicked, but This is the element that I'm trying to bring is art it is an educational stream, and it's right that you highlighted the fact that the Tories are whitewashing creative thinking within the educational system. And I tried to counteract that at different levels. I mean, in our own small community in East Sussex, when we have a lunch club, we try to bring in art of different forms into the lunch club to try and put over a political perspective. They know that we're Labourites in that sense, socialists, and that we're trying to do something in the community and using art as a form to do that. The other thing we'd do is put on an exhibition in the local libraries. It doesn't cost you anything. You just have to book it in. You can put up whatever display you like in local libraries. It takes a little bit of effort, but it's well worth doing if it's in educating the working class. And the other thing that, on a personal basis, is I try to make art affordable. And this is the difficulty: is that pre-loved or second-hand art can be affordable. And what I do is on a regular basis, different art forms, whether it be ceramics or creative art in oils, or as you were talking about, Alan, is pastels, is taking it and putting it on a weekly stall, like people do in the Labour Party or other organisations. They give out leaflets. Whereas what I try to do is encourage people to appreciate the arts by putting on a display each week in the local market. To encourage people to think about art as an experience other than television, you know, that takes you down a very narrow route. So art is important, and that's why I came to this one particularly to listen to you, Alan, and listen to the creative thinking around art forms. And I think I'm going to finish on that. I'm looking at my notes, but yeah, that's enough from me, Alan. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. I'm going to give Steve a chance to come back. Come in.
I think it'd be valuable if Alan, if you could write this up, your report here. It would be a good article, very useful to get it out internationally on the issue of art. And I think that, you know, this is a critical question for the working class. And, you know, one of the things that's happened in the United States in schools is that the capitalists are saying we need to go to STEM, which is education around math or computer coding and that kind of thing, and forget the arts. So particularly in Black school community schools, they closed down the art program at the Martin Luther King Junior High School in San Francisco. They shut down the art program, the music program, and they gave away the instruments for the band. You can't make this up, you know, in a Black school. And, you know, of course, artistic expression of young people is important to their culture. It's important to their development. But the racist and capitalist method of destroying art for young people, which is a means of expression, is completely reactionary and is another example of what the effect of capitalism and the domination of capitalist control of education. So I think that's very important because young people love art and they express themselves and they grow from art. So for revolutionaries, that is a beautiful thing for us to fight for the young people, to have this art, this expression, and to be part of the art movement in showing their lives and their struggles. That's it.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'll just add to Steve's point. I think it's no accident that in the second half of the 20th century, the popular music amongst young people was rock music, which came from blues music, which came from slaves. And it does reflect the fact that young people were looking for the artistic language of the oppressed to express their condition. I'm going to turn this back to you, Alan.
Well, it feels like it's gone very fast, and that's probably because I was talking at 10 to the dozen at the beginning. But it's been a pleasure to be at the meeting. And in a way, I certainly for my own self, I'd like to go away with the notes I made for the meeting and actually think about how I can enlarge on those and how I can expand my knowledge and what I can actually offer the labour movement as we all look to do. I was mindful with Carol talking, there were all great contributions by everybody today, but I was thinking of that moment Carol was talking about in around 1980, 81. And the power of music. There was I remember that time really well, and it's a small example, but Thatcher was ploughing ahead with this horrible agenda that was devastating everybody with its possible, well, not possible, but the deindustrialization and everything else that went, the cuts in services, the privatization of industries and services that were beginning to come, be talked about and be brought forward. And there was a feeling, I remember it was 1981 and at that time, and there was a momentary kind of feeling of real despair. The right wing, the National Front and people were actually, as Carol said, out on the streets. And it looked for a moment like this right-wing agenda, this right-wing government was going to capture the, somehow the imagination of the youth. And then I remember this song just coming out, and it was the Specials singing Ghost Town. And it really caught the moment and caught the sense that people had of what was being lost, that, communities and town centres and things were actually going into decline and there was nothing there for people. And it spurred back the enthusiasm to fight and struggle. Just one song. I remember it certainly did it for me. And the song almost had a kind of a spooky kind of zeitgeist wind to it. It's a haunted kind of melody of that song. But really, what I don't think I got over adequately, and I don't know whether I can do it in the time that is left, but is to suggest that it's more than, we definitely need to do more than just recognise the arts. We actually need to use them really powerfully. The time that we're entering into, certainly in Britain at the moment, and I would imagine it's echoed in so many countries around the world, of increased inflation, of more assaults on working conditions and wages, of welfare being cut, of in Britain things like universal credit really doing the damage that it was designed to do to people's lives, of a growth in child poverty. That what I'm really suggesting is that I think we should be going to the labour movement, the powerful people in the labour movement, certainly in Britain at the moment. They're not so much in the Labour Party, but the left wing MPs in the Labour Party need to get behind this. But it's to go to the trade unions and say, now is the time to build the alternative structures in society. When the cuts have closed the libraries and closed the youth centres, let's open up a labour movement infrastructure that is equivalent to anything that's ever been seen in the labour movement, if not better, and that actually brings people in, develops their skills and talents, gives them hope, gives them an articulate voice, actually introduces them to art forms and ways of being and thinking that they're not normally used to, contradicts completely what the mainstream media are putting out, and the kind of atmosphere of fear politics, of fear and anxiety that neoliberalism and capitalist governments are trying to actually create. And I think that that can happen. And I think if you look at things like moments when there's an election and somebody like Corbyn, when he was standing, managed to attract the Akalas, the Stormses, the Maxine Peaks, the Mark Rylance, all sorts of people, celebrities who came forward. Besides getting trade union support and trade union funds to do these things, we need to bring those celebrities and people in to actually support us all year round, to become mentors for young people, which they act as their best. People like Adele and others, people who've actually said that they support socialism and the labour movement's cause. We need to bring them in. And as John was talking about, at regional level, the Joe Solos and those people that are probably in every region, although I think he's quite a unique character and stands out on his own. The local artists, the people who ran the youth centres, the people who worked in the libraries, the people who might have retired early and given up, the teachers who still have some passion but don't want to teach in a school. We've got to get those people involved because we've got to win out on the estates. We've got to win against this right-wing thrust that I think is beginning to crack, but it needs a socialist message, and it needs one of optimism and hope, and it needs to be creative. It's got to involve people. I'll leave it at that, I hope.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much, Alan. What a wonderful meeting you've led.
It's wonderful people. Thank you.
Brilliant discussion all around. Yes. What were those three? Optimism, hope, and creativity. I think those were the three. Yeah. Let's keep that in our minds as a kind of key takeaway to inspire us from this meeting.
And maybe we could, Ed, if anybody wants to discuss how we might create some kind of manifesto for the arts, maybe it's time for that to happen, and something that we can take. I think Dave was suggesting this to me when we were talking yesterday about the slides, that maybe we need something that tangible that we can take to the trade union leaders and the people who can fund, and the celebrities and people who can put their time and cash into it, to actually get people to endorse something that we could move forward on. And it doesn't just become a meeting or words, you know.
I think that's a brilliant idea, Alan. I mean, Alan, I'm just proposing this to you now. Would you be interested in kind of leading, coming out of this meeting? I can see Dave's got his hand up. Bring it in a minute, Dave. But would you be interested in leading a sort of little working group to formulate a socialist manifesto for the arts, so that we would have some kind of document that comes out of the ideas that we've been kicking around in this meeting?
Yeah, I think it'd need a lot. I mean, I don't know about leading. I'd certainly be prepared to help and to be a part of that, but also to try and draw in more people who aren't necessarily in this meeting today, but might well be waiting for this kind of message to actually engage their talents and what they can offer, you know?
Okay, great. Okay, Dave, you want to say something?
Yeah, I made the suggestion to Alan when we were chatting very briefly, because I'd met him a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, when we went up to a WIN meeting up north, and he gave out leaflets about Bradford Transformed, which I was really impressed with, the work that he'd done up there, and we were just talking about the times now. And one of the things that someone in the NEU told me is that the unions are awash with money because over COVID they haven't had to have conferences. They might be interested in funding arts projects as well as other community type projects, and that's why I thought this idea would have some chance of success. And locally in Newham, as you know, we've got Newham Socialist Labour because our CLPs have been suspended, and we've got this guy Paul Knight who runs a music event, has done for a number of years, and he's come up with lots of fantastic ideas where we're looking at community schemes for arts and many other types of programs. We had a film club night planned, our launch event, but it had to be postponed because someone got COVID. We've had a music event already, and we're looking at book clubs. The very things that Alan was talking about, we're trying to start off because we want to orientate towards the community. So yes, there's the basic stuff about food banks and uniform shops, but also the cultural side of it is really, really important to building a socialist movement.
Thanks very much, Dave. Okay, we're going to follow those ideas up. Bring the meeting to a close. Thank you everyone for your participation. It's been a wonderful, really inspiring meeting. And I look forward to seeing you all next Sunday at 4 o'clock UK time.